They wheeled her in with the soft squeak of rubber on old linoleum, a tiny woman in a cardigan the color of faded violets, oxygen hissing in a steady whisper at her shoulder. Her hands trembled. Parkinson's makes a metronome of what used to be still, but her eyes were steady and bright, like the last two lamps on a dark street that refused to burn out. "Your Honor," she said, voice quivering but clear, "they're stealing from me." It was the kind of sentence a room shrugs at when it comes from someone who looks like she does. Late in life, body folding inward, hair the shade of winter. But the judge, who had seen enough bluster to spot the difference between noise and truth, lifted his gaze and asked her to go on. And in that small invitation, something weighty shifted, like a door unsticking after years of paint. She said the number slowly, like a code she'd carved into memory, 1,847. Every month, like clockwork, disappearing from the invisible place where her government check should have pooled into her small account. She was not alone, she said. There were others, a list she kept even though her hands made letters stumble into each other. People with no visitors. People whose minds, once sharp as paring knives, now glowed and dimmed unpredictably. People called troublesome for asking the kinds of questions that don't make friends. She had names. She had dates. She had the stubborn, unglamorous paperwork of a life lived carefully, bank statements folded and refolded, corners softened like the edges of childhood, photographs. Behind her sat a man whose suit cost more than her monthly rent, a man who owned buildings where the windows never opened and the hallways smelled like disinfectant and meatloaf. He crossed his arms as if to say he'd done this before, that he knew how to outlast a storm in a courthouse. In the gallery, a granddaughter stood very straight, a hospital badge still clipped to her pocket, the fatigue of night shift tugging at her eyelids, but not at her resolve. When the judge asked for the contract, she produced it like a magician pulling a dove from a handkerchief. Except this dove was paper and printing and promise. $1,200, room and board. No mention of the extra $600 or $700 that had been skimming off the top like cream no one was supposed to taste. The judge read, "The way men who care about words read, out loud, evenly, to pin language to air where lies have less room to squirm." He asked the owner where the difference went. The man said enhanced care, as if the word enhanced could cover everything from an extra bath to a mortgage payment. The woman in the chair shook her head and smiled the particular smile of someone who has eaten the same gray chicken cutlet 3 times a week for years. "Nothing is enhanced," she said. "Nothing but your appetite." It should have been a laugh line, but no one laughed. There are moments in a courtroom that feel ordinary until they are not. The judge asked for the books, not the tidy summaries with colorful pie charts and smiling stock photos, but the raw ledgers, the deposits and debits and odd little fees with sunny names. He did not ask like a favor is asked. He ordered like a lock turned from the inside for the first time. The owner's lawyer rose and cited privacy, proprietary this and confidential that, and the judge waited him out like a patient father waits out a child who insists there are monsters in the closet. Then he told the bailiff exactly what records he wanted, and by when, and the room understood it was different now, that something with teeth had entered the story. The woman rested, and her granddaughter's hand found her shoulder with the practiced tenderness of someone who has changed dressings and turned patients so their skin wouldn't break. The judge was thinking of his mother's checkbook, he would later admit, and the way she used to draw a careful line through every expense, taking fierce pride in adding and subtracting without a machine. The owner shifted in his seat. The clock on the wall ticked as if it might testify. When the boxes arrived the next morning, the temperature of the room seemed to drop, as though the past had opened its freezer and let the cold spill out. An accountant stood beside the boxes, a woman whose mouth looked like it had been pressed into a thin line by invisible thumbs. She had the startled, haunted look of a person who's told herself a story long enough to almost believe it, and is now being asked to read the ending out loud. The judge had the gallery cleared and worked in a silence broken only by the soft uncoiling of paper and the slow intake of breath. Numbers are dull until they are not. The pattern emerged the way ink blooms on a napkin. Every month a skim, every resident a vein tapped for extras, every protest categorized as confusion and filed in a drawer labeled clinical. Handwritten notes along the margins made the air taste metallic. Low family contact, safe to increase. Daughter visits monthly, raise slowly. Son asking questions, consider discharge. In one ledger, beside a name the judge recognized now as if she were family, a colder line. Upon death, remaining personal funds to operating account. Families rarely audit balances after funeral. He felt it as a physical thing in his chest, a bruise forming without any hand having struck him. He asked the accountant why, and her voice came fragile, as though it had been kept in a dark cupboard. She spoke of instructions, of legal assurances, of needing the job, of 2 children, of telling herself that confusion was a kind of consent. The judge closed his eyes briefly and then opened them, because closing one's eyes is a comfort, and comforts should be rationed when other people have none. He asked the owner's lawyer if he still wished to argue good faith. The man did, because that is what men like that do until someone switches off the lights. The call to the federal agents came not as performance but as punctuation. The judge used the word scheme and the word elder and the word abuse, and it was like pulling a fire alarm and hearing not a shriek but an answering rustle down the corridors of a larger building. Agents came with their own practiced gentleness around fragile people and their own practiced steel around those who prey on them. The boxes grew to a small city, each street named Money's Owed, Debits Unto Death, the slow hunger of institutions. What began as a number spoken in a quavering voice widened to a map. 1 facility, then 2, then 3. A network of places with floral curtains and bulletin boards where residents' birthdays were thumbtacked beside notices of bingo night and grief group, the pins piercing through paper hearts and paper lives, bleeding ink. The granddaughter waited with her grandmother in a side room that smelled like the coffee volunteers always make too strong. She was angry at herself for the months she had half listened, for the way weariness can make even a nurse shrug off a complaint like lint. "I thought it was the disease," she would say later. "I thought maybe memory made shadows of facts." But the old woman knew numbers the way fishermen know tides. Age had taken her handwriting and slowed her legs. It had not taken the ledger in her head. She'd made the list at a small desk with a mismatched lamp, writing a few names at a time as her medication ebbed and flowed, pausing when her hand spasmed, starting again because dignity, once stolen, is difficult to reacquire unless someone insists. The list lived in a folder under her sweaters. Sometimes she slept with it under her pillow, a hard shape that pressed into her cheek. Proof she still had something worth holding. News of what the judge had found spread like gossip in a schoolyard, except this gossip could restore lives. Children of the residents came, some wary, some already drafting apologies in their mouths for the fight they hadn't fought. The man in the suit stopped crossing his arms and started looking around for shadows to stand in. But there weren't any. The courtroom, for all its polite architecture, had become a place of bright noon. When the judge read the accountant's note about the dead, about balances siphoned after breath had left the lungs, there was a sound no transcript can replicate. The collective intake that happens when pain becomes public. The judge did not raise his voice. He spoke as one does at bedsides and gravesides, words tight and precise, the kind that leave no place for a lie to rest its head. Arrest looks different on men used to giving orders. The handcuffs did not clink dramatically. They did their ordinary job of turning power into pause. As they led the owner away, he managed the incredulous face of a person who's always believed consequences were for other people. The judge turned to the woman in the chair. The charge against her, disturbing the peace, felt suddenly obscene, like accusing a smoke alarm of shrillness during a fire. He dismissed it in the formal way papers require, but when he spoke to her, his voice warmed. "You were not disturbing the peace," he said. "You were trying to restore it." She wept then, not dramatically, but as if some tight, painful knot under her ribs had finally loosened. Her granddaughter folded, not from weakness, but because relief can be heavier than grief. What follows such days is always harder and longer than the headlines suggest. Investigators found other facilities where the policies were the same hearty stew, greed thickened with euphemism, cruelty softened with smiling brochures. Money has a way of connecting people, like veins under skin. Cut one and you often discover a network pulsing toward the same hungry heart. The numbers grew and shrank depending on where the flashlight fell, but the pattern didn't change. Vulnerable residents had become revenue opportunities, and oversight had meant little more than a clipboard carried through hallways once a year, a pen scratching boxes that were always answered yes. In meeting rooms where coffee cooled in styrofoam cups, policymakers said words like reform and transparency and accountability, and those words, which often gathered dust, this time nodded towards someone who had written names with a hand that wouldn't behave. They named it after her, the law that demanded monthly statements written in language normal people could parse, the audits families could request without being labeled difficult, the visitations by ombudsmen with questions that didn't end when the administrator smiled. There were penalties now with numbers in them that couldn't be waved away, and a phone that rang in a state office any hour of day or night, answered by someone paid to say, "Tell me exactly what you're seeing," and then to go see for themselves. Some called the changes overreach, bureaucracy, another layer of paper that would suffocate good facilities along with the bad. But the old woman knew how paper could kill and how paper could save, and when she testified, she used none of the words men use when they like to sound intelligent. She said, "I wrote because no one listened," and a room full of important people went very quiet. She did not become a symbol because symbols are lighter than people, and she had always been heavy with personhood. She still needed help with her meds and someone to steady her as she stood. She liked lemon cookies and the radio on Saturday afternoons, the station that still played big band songs. But she carried a kind of household fame now in a state where churches put out copies of the hotline number next to bulletins, where nurses taped laminated cards inside their locker doors listing the questions to ask a resident about money without making them feel ashamed. Her granddaughter left the hospital job and traded it for a fight with strangers who called at odd hours and cried the way families cry when money and love and guilt get braided together in the dark. They named the nonprofit with the sort of shameless affection grandchildren have, and then they got to work teaching sons and daughters what to look for, which receipts to demand, how to insist without losing visitation privileges. Some of what they recovered was money. All of what they recovered was belonging. The judge framed the list, the original, with its cross-outs and misspellings and the way a capital R sometimes looked like a K because her hand had jerked at the wrong moment, and hung it beside his diplomas, placing an untidy ledger of care where shiny proofs of accomplishment usually live. When visitors came, he would point to it the way a parent points to a drawing on a fridge and say that courage is rarely clean and almost never convenient. That sometimes justice begins with a person everyone has decided is not quite worth the trouble insisting she is. He went on hearing cases that involved barked excuses and tired lies, but the list kept tugging at his sleeve like a small child late for school, reminding him that the loudest person in the room is not always the one to trust, and that occasionally the truth arrives dressed in a cardigan and a cannula and a defiant stare. The suit went to prison, where the clocks keep time for you whether you like it or not. 18 years is both long and insufficient, depending on where you stand. In letters to the court, some wrote that theft is theft, and that stealing nickels from a fountain or fortunes from a pension should land a person in roughly the same place. Others said there is a special kind of wickedness in skimming away dignity from the last stretch of someone's life, in turning their beds into ATM machines that beat politely. In treating death as a balance sheet line, you can sweep into operating accounts because the grief-struck rarely audit the dead. The judge read the letters and said nothing publicly about his own opinion because that wasn't his place anymore. But at home, with his jacket off and his wife reading on the couch, he stared at a spot on the wall where afternoon light made a square and thought about how justice always leaves some corners unlit. The woman took the restitution check and moved to a smaller place where people remembered her name without checking a chart, where the hallways were painted the cheerful yellow of butter, and where someone had the sense to plant tomatoes in a raised bed so residents could pluck one warm from the vine and bite into it and remember Augusts 50 years ago. She kept her oxygen and her shakes and the bone-deep fatigue that gathers after surgeries and long winters, but she also kept her list, now in a frame given to her by a legislator with careful handwriting, and she hung it where she could see it when she woke. It reminded her that patience can be a weapon if sharpened daily, that kindness need not be meek, that being old does not make you an unreliable narrator of your own life. When she died, it was gentle, which felt like a payment owed. She slipped out in the hour nurses call the blue shift before dawn, when the world is quiet enough to hear heating systems click and faraway trucks change gears. Her funeral filled a room with wheelchairs and walkers and canes that clacked like castanets, a percussion section of the resilient. The judge spoke, his voice thickened by age and admiration, and he held up the list the way a priest holds up bread. He did not talk about criminal codes or pleadings. He talked about a woman who refused to be patronized into silence. He told the room that the shaky handwriting had steadied an entire state. That paperwork could be a poem if written at the right hour with the right stubbornness. Afterward, the granddaughter stood by the door and received hands the way people do in churches and community centers when sorrow is shared among strangers. She didn't say she was sorry for their loss because loss cannot be pluralized like that. She said thank you. Thank you for coming. Thank you for believing her when she called you. Thank you for naming what was happening instead of calling it confusion or decline. A young nurse who'd attended one of the nonprofit's trainings slipped her a note that said simply, "I listened better this week," and that small sentence felt like a victory flag the size of a postage stamp. Insignificant to some, everything to others. The law did not fix everything. It never does. There were still homes where the staff were overworked and underpaid, where the televisions were always too loud, where a woman cried each night for her mother who had been dead since 1972. There were still men who looked at a room full of old people and saw a ledger instead of a choir. But the calculus had changed. Those who might have taken would now think twice, then 3 times, because reckoning had a name and a phone number and a judge with a memory like a courtroom portrait. Unblinking, slightly stern. A hint of a smile that says he knows a story you don't. Families without time learned to make time for the unglamorous work of asking for receipts, of highlighting statement lines, of saying that, "No, show me," and meaning it. I think of the moment it began. The first trembling statement spoken into a room that was not inclined to listen. "They're stealing from me." 4 words so often dismissed as the soundtrack of decline. How easy it would have been to chalk it up to a disease that confuses the body's rhythms and sometimes confuses other rhythms too. How tempting to pat a hand and move on to the next case, the next life in a stack of manila folders. But the judge did not pat. He placed the words on the scale, and though they were light in the mouth, they weighed heavy in the balance. He asked for paper. He read. He believed. Belief in a court is never enough on its own. It must be mated with proof. But proof often needs a believer to go looking for it. If you've ever sat by a bedside in a room that smells like hand soap and microwave soup, you've seen how quickly society can erase people who taught 2nd grade for 3 decades, who fixed carburetors, who baked bread before sunrise. We turn them into tasks, meds at 8, vitals at noon, physical therapy at 2. We love them, yes, but love gets tangled in logistics and guilt and the relentless math of modern life. This story is not an indictment of the tired granddaughter who missed a line on a statement any more than it is a redemption song for a judge who did his job well. It is rather a reminder that vigilance is a communal act, that the guardrails we put in place are made of our willingness to raise our hands and ask for the books, to demand receipts, to take seriously the small alarms our elders ring with their thin voices. The shaky handwriting remains, ink faded slightly by sun. Names neatly lined through the letters wobble like newborn colts. Each name a person who ate birthday cake on a paper plate, who had a favorite mug, who once loved someone so much it made their lungs ache. The list makes no mention of heroism. It is an inventory, nothing more. But inventory, when taken with reverence, becomes sacrament. It says, "I see you. I count you. You are not a column to be adjusted. You are a life to be accounted for." In the end, that is what the judge honored, and what the granddaughter built upon, and what the law attempted to enshrine. The radical notion that the final chapters of a life should be annotated with care, not with theft. That truth can arrive wearing a cardigan and an oxygen line and still command a room. That peace, once disturbed by the small hands of greed, can be restored by the steady hand of someone who refuses to stop writing until the numbers add up. So if someone you love looks at you with that fierce clarity age sometimes grants and says something that makes your stomach knot with doubt, listen. Ask for the statements. Sit down with a pen and a highlighter and the patience your younger self did not possess. Call the number if there is one. Tell a judge if you must. Believe that a room will make space for your voice, even if that room has ignored voices like yours before. Trust that there is a ledger under the world that longs to balance, that becomes a little more honest each time a trembling hand writes a name and refuses to let the name be erased. And remember the small woman whose first word sounded like a nuisance and turned out to be an alarm. How she made a list, how she asked a question, how she would not be shushed, How the door stuck with the paint of years gave way when she knocked not once but again and again until someone on the other side said, "Come in, show me, let's see what's true."